Good morning, everyone. My name is Karoun Demirjian. I'm a congressional reporter with the Washington Post focusing on national security policy and a former Moscow correspondent. I'd like to introduce you to my guest today. Margaux Ewen is the North America Executive Director for Reporters Without Borders, and she is going to talk to us today about the newly released 2018 report on the World Press Freedom Index. Before we begin, I just want to let our audience in the room and online know that if you have any questions, you can tweet them to #RSFindex. Those will be questions for Margaux, and I will try to get to a few of them later in the discussion if we have time. Just to start out, though, so every year when this press freedom report comes out, it seems to be a moment in which we look at this map and we say, okay, the West kind of feeling good about themselves, doing pretty well. The rest of the world maybe needs a little bit of help moving along, generally speaking. But as I understand it, that is not actually the story of this year's report. So tell us a little bit about what's going on behind these pictures and numbers.
Exactly. So what we notice in the numbered ranking is that it's a comparative analysis, which means that if you're number 1 or number 4 on the list, it doesn't mean you're perfect in terms of protecting press freedom. It just means that you are better than the bad actors in the index. What the global trend is that we're seeing is that indicator overall globally is showing more and more decline in protection of press freedom. The map is ever darker. Darker meaning situation is very, very bad. And that's due to the way we collect the data. We have quantitative and qualitative analysis. We look at different factors like pluralism, media independence, self-censorship, infrastructure, legislative framework, and also the number of journalists arrested or killed in a given year to compile a score. And the score has worsened overall for worldwide press freedom.
So it's the scores behind these numerical rankings
Exactly.
that we're not looking at here, but those...
The score behind each numerical ranking on the index, which the numerical ranking is comparative with other countries.
And those have fallen, it sounds like.
Yes, many have fallen.
I want to dig into a little bit of why. It'll be difficult, I assume, to come up with one reason for an entire globe, but maybe we can go region by region. So let's start with Europe, given that is the one that we usually assume is going to be doing the best.
Right. It is generally the region in the world where media freedom is the most protected. However, it has experienced the most decline in its score due to its indicators, and this is because a journalist has been murdered in Malta, investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, and the country fell 18 places on the index this year. We're also seeing a similar decline in Slovakia. A journalist was murdered in 2018, several months after Daphne Caruana Galizia was murdered, and they were both covering corruption as investigative reporters. But you also have countries like the United Kingdom, which you think would be a great actor, but ranks at number 40, and that's largely due to the adoption of the Investigatory Powers Act, which can severely limit reporters and whistleblowers' activities.
I see. What about in the Americas? Because that's also an area in which usually does fairly well on this ranking.
So in Latin America, we have a trend of violence, impunity for journalist murders, like for example in Mexico, where 11 journalists were killed in 2017, making it the second deadliest country for media workers after Syria. But you also have authoritarian policies like in Venezuela. And then you have a good actor like Costa Rica, but even Costa Rica fell in the index this year due to harassment of journalists. And
that's been the unique trend this year to have that switch happen?
Yes.
Looking further over, continuing on our global tour here, how about Africa? Talk to us a little bit about what's going on there.
So in Africa, the major concerns are widespread internet shutdowns throughout the region in order to curb coverage of protests. This happens in places like Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But also we have jail terms or police harassment of journalists who are trying to cover the fight against terrorism, specifically Boko Haram in Mali and Nigeria.
And when you talk about the shutdowns of the internet, what are you referring to more specifically?
So I think it goes to shutdown of cellular service, but also any kind of use of internet social media apps on people's phones so that they can get information about where protest is occurring, or have there been arrests, have there been violent assaults, have there been deaths at a protest, things that journalists should normally be able to cover freely.
And that's something that we talk about, or we have talked about in various coverage of what things are happening in the Middle East.
That's
so is
correct.
that a similar trend there? Or?
We do see similar trends in the Middle East. However, it does have the worst performance regionally internationally in the index. And we do see repression of journalism through the use of anti-terrorism or cybercrime legislation in places like Egypt, but also in the Gulf states. But then, of course, you have deadly countries for reporting, like Syria and Yemen, countries in conflict, Syria being the deadliest country still for journalists in 2017.
Right, and that makes sense given the general situation of what's happening in Syria right now, that would be reflected for the press as well. It is, I feel like Asia is almost too big of a region to ask you to paint one trend, but tell me what is going on in that very large part of the world that stands out to you.
If I could highlight one thing, it's the exportation of China's authoritarian model and control of information. China, as you know, is the biggest prison in the world for both professional and non-professional journalists, and 2 imprisoned bloggers, writers, died in 2017 due to untreated cancer while they were in detention. But this model has been exported to places like Cambodia, places like Vietnam, where there's crackdown on independent bloggers. Bloggers in Vietnam now could face 15-year jail sentences for simply trying to relay information to the public.
Wow. So we went on a little global tour there about all the different regions and the highlights of what's going on, mostly negative highlights at this point, but sticking with that theme, you have tracked what are the worst stories basically around the globe as you've identified them. Tell me a little bit about why you chose these countries to represent the downslide in press freedom, and also if there's anything that they have in common as to why.
Right. So, just individually, as a little snapshot, Cambodia, we downgraded 10 points because of their closing more than 30 independent media outlets and their prime minister being very outwardly insulting of media freedom and at times even quoting the U.S. President Donald Trump in so doing. Malta, as we touched on, the downgrade being due to the murder of the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who, before her death, experienced threats, intimidation, but also had multiple defamation cases opened against her, some of which were still being litigated after her murder.
Just for the reporting that she was
Just for the reporting that she was doing to uncover corruption in Malta. And then in Venezuela, we wanted to highlight that decline, given that everyone is pretty much familiar with what's going on with the leadership under Maduro. Physical attacks against journalists who are covering protests are widespread, as well as destruction of equipment, but also foreign journalists trying to cover that are getting deported. And state censorship is coming from the telecommunications regulator. As for Mauritania, it was really due to a piece of legislation that it dropped 17 points, and that is a law that made apostasy and blasphemy punishable by death.
Okay, yeah, that's a fairly serious punishment to squelch on what journalists are trying to do. And that was just passed in the last year?
Yes, it was passed in 2017.
Okay. Well, that's the bad news. I assume there's some good news as well. Or you've tracked at least that there is some good news, even in a generally bleaker picture as to what's going on across the globe. So tell us a little bit about these good news stories and if there's anything that we can learn from that as well.
Of course. So we have noticed several different countries that have risen in the index, and we've chosen to highlight Ecuador, Gambia, and South Korea from 3 different regions in the world, largely because they all share the same underlying trait. They all experienced regime change, and that led to an easing of tension between journalists and the head of state or state-owned media companies like in South Korea, but also promised reforms under new leadership where it was very repressive in the past.
I mean, it seems like you can't really tell the story of what's going on journalistically without telling the greater story about what's happening politically in these countries, right? I mean, you just mentioned regime change. So given that, I mean, tell me a little bit about the relationship between the press and governments in some of these countries where you have had regimes that are not changed. You still have strongman governments, potentially. You still have places where the question of what is a journalist, who is allowed to function as a journalist, isn't really completely established or answered.
That's true, and Reporters Without Borders takes account of different types of media workers, so professional journalists who may be accredited in the traditional sense, but also citizen journalists, bloggers, and then media workers like cameramen, translators, etc. And places where the state controls all media outlets or all messaging associated with the regime, like in Vietnam, for example, where the only source of independent information comes from bloggers, also in China. But you also have that increasingly in places like Azerbaijan or in Turkey, which, as we know, Erdogan was democratically elected, but he has wiped out independent journalism and the rule of law. More than 100 media outlets have been closed, and it's the largest prison in the world for professional journalists.
When that happens, what replaces it? Does anything replace it, and would you even call it journalism?
State propaganda.
And that is an issue in places that you just mentioned, or, I mean, personally speaking, having been a former Moscow correspondent, when you talk about those things, my mind just goes to Russia, but you know the greater scope of what's happening across the globe.
Yes, and Russia, as you mentioned, is definitely one of the key examples. Their individual ranking may not have worsened this year, but they were already so low to begin with. Their score actually worsened, and there are now more journalists and bloggers detained now in Russia than at any other time since the breakup of the Soviet Union. So that's really telling. In a place like Egypt as well, which also stays constant in its place in the index, its score has also worsened. It prosecutes journalists now for practicing terrorism, as I mentioned earlier, but it's seeking the death penalty for a notable photojournalist named Shokan. That's a worsening of the situation. But there's also multiple NGO websites have been blocked, including Reporters Without Borders website, and so that attributed to its scores further decline this year.
You just talked about two countries where it seems like the situation is fairly entrenched. I assume people are trying to do something to shake those situations out of that entrenchment, but is that, what is going on to try to do that, or is this something you have to just kind of watch and say, isn't this a shame that we can't seem to improve these situations in certain countries that have now a multi-year history of repressive tactics towards journalists?
Well, being an advocacy group, the index that we publish every year, ranking 180 countries, is used as an advocacy tool. We do use it to denounce repression of media freedom around the world. And so we hope that we can pressure these governments into facilitating change. And we have seen some countries react to our index, like, for example, Canada, which before this year's index, we had downgraded over the past 2 years prior, 14 places. It fell 14 places on our index due to spying on journalists, trying to meddle with their confidential sources. And what we saw was the index propelled government representatives and lawmakers to make change. They adopted a universal press shield law at the federal level in Canada. They set up a commission of inquiry to look into journalist spying. However, we still need to see that they will really apply that law, because there are still quite a lot of problems in Canada. So we will continue to use the index to pressure countries like Canada into facilitating positive change.
Does that work best with countries that seem to care about their reputation that way, like Canada? I mean, could you translate that experience of having actually affected a good switch to someplace like Vietnam or places that you listed before that seem to be a little bit more resistant to the impression that they're putting out there?
Well, when we deal with different governments where we think we can put pressure on repressive regimes, we do always use the index as a great way to kind of anchor where they sit in the spectrum of respecting press freedom and activities of journalists. And we do think that it can play a naming and shaming effect on certain governments that still care about their reputation internationally.
Just in the last day, I think, our colleague Jason Rezaian, who will be on the next panel, who's coming up, had a story that he pointed out about how Turkey has more journalists behind bars. You mentioned how there are various countries that are jails, basically, for journalists because they're trying to do their jobs, and that has resulted in a dip and a slide in the rankings of these countries. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on? I believe you mentioned China also as an issue there, specifically in those countries where we're actually talking about imprisonment of journalists, and why, or if that's actually worsening, why that's the case.
So it seems that, as we reported, a decline in the number of killings compared to the prior year when we did our annual report at the end of 2017, that more and more journalists are being imprisoned, or more and more journalists are feeling like it's unsafe for them to report in certain areas of the world, so they're no longer putting themselves as much as physical risk. But when we do see these lengthened jail terms, like for example in Vietnam, a 15-year jail sentence for bloggers, that's an uptick of repression we had seen in prior years. In China, this lack of medical care for bloggers or writers who are sick with cancer and not able to adequately treat it. I mean, that's just a symbol of how deeply entrenched this desire to lock people up and throw away the key is.
And is it working from what you've seen, just kind of tracking what the activists are in those countries and the journalists who are trying to work around some of these laws? What's your assessment of how much of a chilling effect it's actually successfully having?
Well, I think that many people in these countries have resorted to self-censorship or have decided to work in exile. A country like Burundi, for example, which experienced great violence during the attempted coup in 2015. But since then, many journalists are working outside of the country for fear of their lives.
We talk a lot in this country. I mean, this is clearly a global survey, right? We're sitting in Washington, D.C., though, and we like to think that we have an influence on the way the rest of the world can work. So what is your assessment, though, of how we're wielding that influence? Are we doing what we should be doing? What do you think about what we are doing right now, both at home and abroad?
So what we're seeing here in the United States is a declining trend of respect for press freedom. So we've now slipped another 2 places on the index to 45 out of 180 countries, which is pretty shocking and disappointing for the country of the First Amendment. But we were already on this downward trend before our current president, took us a little bit further. So we had crackdown on whistleblowers under the Obama administration. He was tight-lipped on the messaging coming out of the White House and difficult to really be fully transparent about his administration's activities. But journalists were also getting arrested while covering protests around the country, North Dakota, but also Black Lives Matter protests. That trend has continued and worsened under Trump, but he has added this extra layer of outward hatred of journalism and media freedom and disrespect for the First Amendment that comes from his comments, calling journalists enemy of the American people, calling for certain media outlets' licenses to be revoked.
The examples Cameron gave in his opening speech.
Exactly, and we're all familiar with them. But also, when he retweets violent memes of journalists from CNN getting assaulted, and then you see physical assaults of journalists, and we had Greg Gianforte on the eve of his election to Congress in Montana assault a journalist from The Guardian, and then he won that election. So that's really shocking that someone who assaults a journalist could win an election, and it's probably because this rhetoric is coming down from the highest office in the country. So what does that mean internationally? It means that we are not setting the example that we used to set at home that might have made us more credible when we ask for other countries that are generally repressive of press freedom to respect the role of journalists in a democracy.
Have you seen that actually manifesting itself, though? I mean, we talk about we're supposed to be setting a good example, and certainly that is a noble thing to say, but have you actually seen examples of where, because as your assessment is that we're not right now, that's actually having an effect on what we're hearing coming out of other world leaders or other parts of the globe?
Yes, definitely. We've seen Erdogan in Turkey mimic Trump's remarks, as well as the Prime Minister in Cambodia. In the Philippines, Duterte and Trump have both called journalists sons of bitches. So we know that there is a correlation there. And there was also a recent story about the U.S. ambassador in Uganda trying to kind of highlight the concerns for press freedom in that country. And the press minister of Uganda basically said, your president can't even take questions at a press conference, so please don't lecture me on our press freedom here. So that's really telling. I mean, that can have a direct impact on our diplomacy efforts to encourage the release of journalists.
Indeed. Just to remind everybody that if you have any questions to tweet to us, the hashtag is #RSFindex. I'm just wondering, though, as stepping back from these very specific discussions we've been having about countries and what they are doing, aren't doing, what is happening that isn't happening, if you look again at just the full survey of everything from this report, clearly the opening takeaway was not the greatest of news. But what's your advice, I guess, or your message that you want to kind of leave the audience with, leave us with about what your predictions are or what your prescriptions might be for improving the situation globally in the future?
Well, I think the public needs to realize that journalists are playing a public service role. And at the end of the day, journalists, media workers, bloggers, they are all taking these risks to report the news for the public's benefit. And the public needs to stand up and fight for their freedom to do their job. Journalism is an essential pillar of any democracy, and as we see democracies on the decline, in this latest edition of the index, more on decline than they have been in the past, we really need citizens to stand up and fight for the right of journalists to do their reporting because it affects their right to know.
And is that something that you're able to translate that message, you think, directly to those citizens, or is this kind of incumbent on the journalists in these local places to try to just get that message out?
Well, I think that citizens do play a role in supporting journalism, either by purchasing a local news outlet or sharing articles that they find interesting, purchasing news from a local news outlet or sharing articles that they find interesting with their surrounding entourage. I think that that's important. And to raise their voice when people are detained for doing their job, or when they're killed, and we need to have a credible and independent investigation into their murder.
Anywhere in the world.
Anywhere in the world.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So I just want to thank Margaux for being here and sharing her insights and expertise with all of us, and turn it over to my colleague, Dana Priest, who will be leading the next conversation. Thank you very much for your engagement. Actually, excuse me, there's one more thing that I did promise Margaux. There is a specific journalist that we want to make sure we don't forget to mention, somebody who is rather close to the Washington Post family, actually, and I want to just let Margaux say a few words about that before we actually depart the stage.
Thank you so much, Karoun, for bringing that up. I just wanted to take a moment to recognize Austin Tice, the last American journalist detained in Syria since 2012. I would like to see him home safely soon, just as Jason Rezaian, the Washington Post's own reporter who was detained in Iran, came to this very room for a welcome back party. We hope that we can have the same celebration at Austin's return. If you want to tweet support for the family, you can always tweet #FreeAustinTice. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.